They don't explode. They don't argue. They don't even warn you. One day they're just gone. And that's what makes this dangerous, because if you're dealing with an empath, you're not dealing with weakness. You're dealing with someone who's been silently tracking every inconsistency, every shift in tone, every moment your actions didn't match your words. See, most people think empaths are easy to manipulate, but what they don't realize is there's a line you never see. And once you cross it, there's no negotiation, no closure, no second chance. In this talk, I'm going to show you exactly what triggers that switch, what makes an empath completely remove you from their life, and why, once it happens, you don't get them back. Emotional inconsistency is one of the fastest ways to lose an empath, and most people don't even realize they're doing it. One moment you're warm, attentive, and present, and the next you're distant, cold, or distracted without explanation. To most people, this might come off as normal human behavior, but to an empath, it's a signal. They don't just hear what you say, they study patterns, shifts, and emotional rhythms. When your energy doesn't align with your words, it creates a silent alarm in their mind. They begin to question not just what changed, but why it changed, and more importantly, whether it's safe to stay emotionally invested. An empath operates on emotional clarity. They look for congruence between what you express and what you actually feel. When you tell them everything is fine, but your tone, body language, or attention says otherwise, they don't ignore it, they absorb it. And over time, these small inconsistencies stack up. It becomes a pattern they can't unsee. They start replaying conversations, analyzing interactions, and noticing the subtle disconnects that most people overlook. This isn't overthinking to them, it's data collection. Every mixed signal becomes another piece of evidence that something is off. What makes this even more powerful is that empaths rarely confront immediately. They don't jump into conflict or demand explanations at the first sign of inconsistency. Instead, they observe, they give space, they wait to see if your behavior corrects itself or if the inconsistency continues. And during this period, something critical is happening internally. They're slowly detaching, not out of anger, but out of self-protection. Because to an empath, emotional unpredictability feels unsafe. It creates a sense of instability that they can't comfortably exist in. If the inconsistency continues, it begins to erode trust in a way that's almost invisible from the outside. You might think everything is fine because there's no argument, no confrontation, no dramatic fallout. But internally, the empath is recalibrating their connection to you. They're pulling back their energy, investing less, caring a little less each time. And the most dangerous part is that this process is quiet. There are no warning signs that are obvious unless you know what to look for. Their responses become shorter, their enthusiasm fades, their presence feels different, but they don't announce why. From your perspective, it might seem like they're losing interest or becoming distant for no reason. But from their perspective, they're responding to a pattern you've been consistently showing. Emotional inconsistency tells them that what they feel from you today can't be trusted tomorrow. And for someone who feels deeply, that unpredictability becomes exhausting. They don't want to constantly adjust to shifting emotional states that aren't explained or acknowledged. They don't want to decode mixed signals forever. Eventually, a threshold is reached. Not because of one big moment, but because of repeated small ones. Each inconsistency adds weight, and at some point it becomes too heavy to carry. That's when the empath makes a decision, not impulsively, but with clarity. They stop trying to understand, stop trying to fix, stop trying to stay connected to something that feels unstable. And when they make that shift, it's not temporary. It's a complete withdrawal of emotional access. What looks like a sudden disappearance is actually the result of a long, silent process. A process where every inconsistency you showed was noticed, felt, and stored until the pattern became undeniable. And by the time you realize something has changed, they've already done the internal work of letting go. Repeated boundary violations don't trigger an empath all at once. They wear them down in layers. The first time you cross a line, they notice it immediately, but they don't react the way most people expect. They don't explode, they don't create a scene, and they don't rush to punish you for it. Instead, they pause. They assess. They try to understand whether it was intentional, careless, or simply a misunderstanding. Because empaths tend to give people the benefit of the doubt, they often allow that first violation to pass with minimal resistance, sometimes even without mentioning it directly. But here's what most people miss. Just because an empath doesn't react doesn't mean they didn't register it. They felt it fully. They just chose patience over confrontation. In their mind, they're giving you room to self-correct. They're watching to see if you recognize the line you crossed and adjust your behavior without being forced to. This is where the silent evaluation begins. Every action that follows is measured against that first moment. If your behavior shifts in a more respectful direction, trust can stabilize. But if the same boundary gets crossed again, something changes internally. The second violation doesn't feel like a second chance. It feels like confirmation. It tells the empath that what happened before wasn't accidental. It starts to form a pattern. And patterns are what matter most to them. They don't judge based on isolated incidents. They judge based on repeated behavior. At this stage, they may begin to create subtle distance. Not enough for you to immediately notice, but enough for them to protect their emotional space. They might share less, engage less, or become slightly more reserved in how they interact with you. If the violations continue, the dynamic shifts even further. The empath begins to feel disrespected, but not in a loud or confrontational way. It's a quiet realization that their needs, limits, and emotional comfort are not being considered. And for someone who naturally prioritizes others, this realization hits deeper than it would for most. Because when an empath sets a boundary, it's not casual. It usually comes after they've already tolerated more than they should have. So when that boundary is ignored, it sends a clear message to them that their patience is being taken advantage of. What makes this process dangerous for the other person is how controlled the empath remains on the surface. There's no dramatic escalation, no emotional outbursts that signal something is wrong. Instead, there's a gradual withdrawal of energy. They stop overextending, they stop accommodating, they stop investing at the same level. And because this shift is subtle, it often goes unnoticed until the connection feels completely different. The warmth that was once there starts to fade, replaced by a kind of emotional neutrality that wasn't there before. At this point, the empath is no longer trying to fix the situation. They're observing from a distance, mentally preparing for separation. They've already identified the pattern, and now they're deciding what to do about it. And this decision isn't based on emotion alone, it's based on accumulated evidence. Every ignored boundary reinforces the same conclusion. This environment is not safe for them to stay emotionally open. And once that conclusion solidifies, their behavior changes in a way that's almost impossible to reverse. They begin to reclaim their space in ways that may seem small on the outside, but are significant internally. They become less available, less responsive, less emotionally accessible. They no longer prioritize your needs over their own. And most importantly, they stop explaining themselves. Because from their perspective, they've already given enough chances for understanding to happen naturally. They've already shown where the lines are. Repeating those explanations feels unnecessary and draining. What often confuses people is that this entire shift can happen without a clear conversation. There's no final warning, no explicit statement that says, "This is your last chance." The empath doesn't operate on ultimatums. They operate on observation and internal decision-making. By the time you realize something is off, they've already moved through multiple stages of evaluation, disappointment, and detachment. And when the final cutoff happens, it doesn't come from anger. It comes from clarity. A clear recognition that staying connected means continuing to experience the same pattern, and that pattern no longer aligns with their sense of self-respect. So they remove themselves completely, not as a reaction, but as a resolution. Lack of authenticity is something an empath detects almost instantly, even when everyone else in the room is convinced by the performance. It's not about catching obvious lies or dramatic deception. It's about the subtle misalignment between what you present and what you actually are. The tone that doesn't quite match the words, the smile that doesn't reach the eyes, the agreement that feels forced instead of real. These are the signals an empath picks up on without effort because they're not just listening to language, they're reading emotional truth. When someone shows up without authenticity, it creates a kind of static in the connection. The interaction might seem normal on the surface, but underneath, it feels off. And for an empath, That feeling is impossible to ignore. They don't brush it aside or rationalize it away. They sit with it. They observe it. They begin to question what's real and what's being constructed. Because authenticity is the foundation of trust for them. And when that foundation starts to crack, everything built on top of it becomes unstable. At first, they may try to give space for alignment to happen. They might assume you're holding back, protecting yourself, or adjusting to the situation. Empaths are naturally understanding of complexity in people, so they don't immediately label someone as fake or dishonest. Instead, they watch for consistency. They look for moments where your guard drops and something genuine comes through. They pay attention to whether your behavior aligns over time or continues to shift depending on what benefits you in the moment. If the lack of authenticity continues, it starts to create distance internally, not because they've decided to reject you, but because they can't fully connect with something that doesn't feel real. They may still engage in conversation, still respond, still show up, but the depth changes. The openness that once existed begins to close. They stop sharing as much of themselves because they don't feel like they're meeting the real version of you. And without that mutual authenticity, the connection starts to feel one-sided and hollow. One of the key things to understand is that empaths don't need proof in the traditional sense. They don't require evidence laid out in front of them to know something isn't right. Their perception operates on a level that picks up on emotional incongruence quickly and accurately. So when authenticity is missing, they don't wait for a major incident to confirm it. The absence of realness itself becomes the confirmation. And once that recognition sets in, it changes how they engage entirely. They begin to detach, not in a dramatic way, but in a controlled and intentional manner. They stop investing emotionally in the version of you that feels constructed. They stop trying to decode mixed signals or hidden intentions. Instead, they shift their focus inward, preserving their energy for connections that feel genuine and grounded. Because for an empath, staying connected to inauthentic energy isn't just uncomfortable, it's draining. From the outside, this shift can be confusing. You might still be showing up the same way you always have, saying the same things, playing the same role. But what you don't see is that the empath is no longer responding to the surface. They've already moved past that layer and decided it's not something they can rely on. And once that decision is made, their behavior reflects it. They become less engaged, less expressive, less available in ways that are subtle but consistent. There's also a point where they stop trying to understand why the authenticity is missing. Early on, they might analyze it, consider different explanations, or even question their own perception. But as the pattern continues, that curiosity fades. It gets replaced by acceptance. Not acceptance of the behavior as something they're okay with, but acceptance that this is what you're choosing to present. And that acceptance removes the need to keep exploring or hoping for something different. At that stage, the connection no longer holds the same meaning it once did. It's no longer a space of genuine exchange, but a surface-level interaction that lacks depth and trust. And for someone who values emotional truth above everything else, that kind of connection isn't sustainable. So without confrontation, without drama, without a clear announcement, they begin to step away from it entirely. Emotional draining without reciprocity is something an empath feels long before they consciously define it. At the beginning, they give freely. Their attention, their energy, their understanding, it flows naturally because that's how they're wired. They listen deeply, they show up consistently, and they make space for emotions that others often ignore. And in the early stages, they don't keep score. They're not measuring who gives more or who takes more. They're focused on connection, on presence, on being there in a way that feels meaningful. But over time, a pattern begins to form. The conversations start to revolve around you, your problems, your stress, your needs, while their inner world slowly gets pushed to the side. They become the one you turn to when things fall apart, the one who absorbs the weight of your emotions without hesitation. And at first, they accept this role without resistance. Because helping others isn't a burden to them. It's something they genuinely care about. They believe that if they continue to show up, the balance will naturally even out. What they start to notice, though, is that the balance never shifts. The moments where they need support don't get the same level of attention. When they open up, the response feels surface level, distracted, or quickly redirected back to you. It's not always obvious or intentional. Sometimes it's subtle, a lack of follow-up, a change of subject, a response that doesn't fully acknowledge what they shared. But to an empath, these small moments carry weight. They signal a lack of emotional reciprocity that becomes harder to ignore with time. As this dynamic continues, the empath begins to feel the drain, not all at once, but gradually. It's the exhaustion of constantly holding space without being held in return. It's the quiet realization that the connection is becoming one-sided, even if the other person doesn't see it that way. And because empaths are often patient, they don't immediately withdraw. They give more chances. They try to adjust. They might even convince themselves that the other person just doesn't realize what's happening. During this phase, something important shifts internally. The empath becomes more aware of how much energy they're giving versus how much they're receiving. They start noticing how they feel after interactions, drained instead of fulfilled, heavy instead of balanced. This awareness doesn't always lead to confrontation. In many cases, it leads to quiet adjustment. They begin to pull back slightly, conserving their energy in small ways. They may respond less quickly, engage less deeply, or create subtle distance without making it obvious. If the lack of reciprocity continues, the emotional connection begins to weaken. Not because the empath stops caring entirely, but because they can't sustain the same level of investment in something that doesn't replenish them. They start to detach from the role they've been playing. The constant listener, the emotional support system, the person who's always there, it becomes a role they no longer feel aligned with, and stepping out of that role changes the entire dynamic. From the outside, this shift can feel confusing. The empath who was once always available now seems distant. The conversations that once flowed easily now feel shorter, less engaged. But what's actually happening is a rebalancing. They're no longer overextending themselves to maintain a connection that lacks mutual effort. They're choosing to redirect their energy toward themselves or toward relationships that offer the same depth in return. There's also a point where they stop expecting the other person to change. Early on, there may have been hope that the imbalance would correct itself, that awareness would grow, that the connection would evolve into something more mutual. But as the pattern continues, that hope fades. It gets replaced by clarity, a clear understanding that the dynamic as it exists is not sustainable for them in the long term. And once that clarity sets in, their behavior becomes more intentional. They don't just pull back randomly. They do it with purpose. They limit how much they give, how much they engage, how much of themselves they make available. And in doing so, they begin to create emotional space between themselves and the person who has been draining them, a space that continues to grow quietly, steadily, until the connection no longer holds the same presence it once did. Manipulation attempts are something an empath senses far earlier than most people expect, not because they're actively looking for it, but because their awareness is tuned to emotional intention. They don't just hear what you say. They register why you're saying it, how it's being delivered, and what emotional response you're trying to create. So when someone uses guilt, pressure, subtle control, or strategic vulnerability to influence them, it doesn't land the way it's intended. Instead of being pulled in, they become more alert. At first, the manipulation might be subtle enough that it doesn't trigger immediate withdrawal. The empath notices the shift in tone, the slight push behind certain words, or the way a situation is framed to create a specific reaction. They may not label it as manipulation right away, but they feel that something about the interaction isn't clean. There's an underlying agenda that doesn't match the surface message. And that mismatch is enough to create distance in their perception. Empaths often give people room to be imperfect, so they don't instantly assume malicious intent. They consider context. They ask themselves whether the behavior could be coming from insecurity, fear, or a lack of awareness. This is why manipulation attempts don't always get confronted immediately. Instead, they're observed. The empath watches to see if the behavior repeats, evolves, or reveals a clearer pattern over time. Because for them, one moment doesn't define a person. Patterns do. When those patterns begin to form, the empath's response shifts. What might have been curiosity or patience turns into quiet recognition. They start to see the strategy behind the words, the emotional hooks being used, the timing of certain behaviors that seem designed to create obligation or control. Whether it's guilt tripping, playing the victim to gain sympathy, or creating artificial urgency to pressure a decision, these tactics become more visible with repetition. Once that recognition is in place, the empath stops responding in the same way. They don't get pulled into the emotional current that the manipulation is trying to create. Instead, they become more grounded, more neutral, more difficult to influence. Their responses may become shorter, less reactive, less emotionally engaged. Not because they don't care, but because they've chosen not to participate in a dynamic that feels controlled or forced. This shift often confuses the person attempting the manipulation. The tactics that may have worked before suddenly lose their effect. The empath no longer responds with the same level of empathy or urgency. They don't rush to fix, to reassure, or to comply. And because this change happens without a dramatic confrontation, it can feel like a sudden disconnection. But in reality, it's a calculated withdrawal of emotional participation. As the behavior continues, the empath's internal stance becomes more firm. They stop questioning whether they're overreacting or misinterpreting the situation. The pattern has become clear enough that doubt no longer holds weight. They accept what they're seeing without needing further confirmation. And with that acceptance comes a stronger boundary, one that doesn't need to be announced to be enforced. They begin to limit access in subtle ways. They share less personal information, reducing the emotional material that could be used to influence them. They become more selective in how they respond, choosing not to engage with statements or situations that feel manipulative. Their presence becomes more controlled, more intentional, less available to dynamics that rely on emotional leverage. There's also a point where the empath stops trying to understand the motivation behind the manipulation. Early on, they might analyze it, trying to see the underlying cause or emotional need driving the behavior. But as it repeats, that need to understand fades. It's replaced by a focus on protecting their own space rather than decoding someone else's actions. From the outside, this can look like emotional distance or disinterest, but internally, it's a clear decision to disengage from a pattern that feels inauthentic and controlling. And once that decision is made, it doesn't reverse easily. Because for an empath, trust isn't just about what is said. It's about the intention behind it. And when that intention feels compromised, the connection loses its foundation piece by piece, until there's nothing left for them to hold on to. The final cutoff doesn't happen in a moment of anger or impulse. It's the result of a long internal process that most people never see. By the time an empath reaches this point, they've already gone through cycles of observation, understanding, patience, and quiet adjustment. They've noticed the patterns, felt the inconsistencies, experienced the imbalance, and slowly come to terms with what the connection actually is. What looks sudden from the outside is, in reality, something they've been preparing for over time. In the early stages, they don't even consider cutting someone off completely. That idea feels extreme to them because they naturally look for ways to maintain connection, to understand, to give space for growth. Even when things feel off, they try to work around it internally. They adjust their expectations, lower their emotional investment, and attempt to find a version of the connection that feels manageable. This is why they often stay longer than most people would. Not because they're unaware, but because they're willing to give more chances than they probably should. As the pattern continues, something begins to shift in how they see the situation. It's no longer about isolated issues or moments that can be explained away. It becomes a clear, consistent reality that doesn't align with what they need emotionally. And once that clarity forms, it changes the way they think. They stop asking themselves if things will improve and start recognizing that what they're experiencing is likely to continue. This shift from hope to acceptance is subtle but powerful. During this phase, their detachment deepens. They're no longer emotionally reacting to every inconsistency or imbalance. Instead, They become more neutral, more observant, more internally focused. The connection starts to lose its emotional intensity. What once mattered deeply begins to feel distant. They may still interact, still respond, still be present in a surface level way, but the depth that once defined the relationship is no longer there. It's been gradually withdrawn piece by piece. What's important to understand is that this detachment isn't cold or careless. It's controlled. It's intentional. They're creating space within themselves before they create it externally. Because when the final decision comes, they don't want it to be driven by emotion. They want it to come from clarity, from a place where they've fully processed what they've experienced and what it means for them moving forward.